There are stories in Hollywood that inspire, stories that entertain, and stories that feel like they were written by the hands of fate itself. But once in a while there comes a story so raw, so human, and so powerful that it transcends fame, fortune, and the silver screen. It becomes a story of survival, a story of redemption, and above all, a story of hope. This is the story of Robert Downey Jr., a man whose life once spiraled into the darkest pits of addiction, loss, and despair, only for him to rise from the ashes like a real-life phoenix, becoming not just a movie icon, but a symbol of transformation. The man who went from handcuffs to hero, from drugs to Iron Man. Robert Downey Jr. was born on April 4, 1965, in Manhattan, New York. He came into a world already spinning with creativity, chaos, and contradiction. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was an avant-garde filmmaker and actor known for his offbeat projects. His mother, Elsie, was an actress. But more than the bright lights of cinema, Robert's childhood was shaped by something else, something darker. A home where drugs were present, casual, even normalized. Downey Sr. was addicted to drugs, and his son's exposure to that world came far too early. Robert has admitted that his father introduced him to marijuana at just 6 years old. Imagine that, a child barely able to tie his shoes, inhaling a substance that would one day play a devastating role in his life. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't evil. In fact, Downey Sr. later said it was a way to bond with his son. A twisted way, yes, but in his drug-addled mind it made sense. It was a generational curse disguised as connection, and so began a dangerous cycle. Robert's youth was spent oscillating between acting classes and drug use, between film sets and wild nights. As a teen, he bounced from school to school, eventually dropping out to pursue acting full-time. But the seeds of destruction had already been planted. Despite the chaos, Robert was brilliant, magnetic, a prodigy on screen. He had an energy, a vulnerability, and a quick wit that made him stand out from the beginning. Hollywood noticed, directors noticed, casting agents noticed. He wasn't just another kid with famous parents, he had it, that intangible spark. His performances were raw and real, and by the mid-1980s he was climbing fast. Roles in films like Less Than Zero and Chaplin showcased his range. In fact, his portrayal of Charlie Chaplin in 1992 earned him an Academy Award nomination. He was, by all accounts, one of the most talented actors of his generation. But behind the screen he was falling apart. Drugs weren't just a part of his past. They had become his present, his reality. Cocaine, heroin, alcohol, whatever numbed the pain, whatever silenced the noise, he consumed it. His behavior became erratic. He missed call times. He got into trouble. He lost jobs. But worse than that, he lost himself. In 1996, the cracks became impossible to hide. Robert was arrested for possession of heroin, cocaine, and a .357 Magnum handgun. The image was jarring, a rising star in shackles, dazed and hollow-eyed. Hollywood gasped. Fans were stunned. But the tragedy had only just begun. After the arrest, he was given probation, but he couldn't stay clean. Just a month later, he was again arrested, this time for breaking into a neighbor's house while under the influence. He didn't steal anything. He didn't hurt anyone. He just collapsed on the bed and passed out. Lost, alone, addicted. The courts tried rehab. They tried probation. They tried leniency. But addiction doesn't listen to logic. It doesn't care about fame. It doesn't respond to reason. And so Robert kept falling. In 1999, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for violating his probation. Ironically, it was there, in a cell surrounded by concrete and steel, that the first seeds of clarity began to take root. Not sobriety, not yet, but the beginning of an awakening. He served about a year and was released, but staying clean outside was harder. There were moments of hope, small roles, second chances, but they never lasted long. Hollywood, once enchanted by his brilliance, began to lose faith. Insurance companies wouldn't cover him. Studios stopped calling. Directors didn't want to risk it. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when Robert was fired from the hit TV show Ally McBeal, despite winning a Golden Globe for his performance. He was finally showing the world he could still act, still shine, but another relapse destroyed it. Arrested again, fired again. Headlines once again read, "Downfall, train wreck, wasted talent." It seemed final. It seemed hopeless. But there was a flicker, Somewhere deep inside, Robert Downey Jr. wasn't done fighting. He had tried rehab before many times, but this time was different. This time it wasn't for his image. It wasn't for a job. It was for himself. And perhaps even more importantly, for love. In 2003, he met Susan Levin, a sharp, focused film producer. She saw something in him, something worth saving. And unlike others, she drew a line. She told him clearly, "If you don't get clean, we can't be together." There would be no exceptions, no negotiations. It was the ultimatum he needed. And this time, he chose love. He went back to rehab. He stayed clean. He practiced martial arts, took up therapy, surrounded himself with positive people. He got rid of toxic friends. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, he began to rebuild. Not just his career, but his soul. Hollywood, however, doesn't forget easily. Forgiveness is rare. Trust is expensive. But in 2008, something extraordinary happened. A role came along that would change not just his life, but cinematic history. Tony Stark, Iron Man. Marvel Studios at the time was not the powerhouse it is today. In fact, Iron Man was a gamble. A huge one. And when Jon Favreau, the director, suggested Robert Downey Jr. for the role, the studio balked. They hesitated. How could they trust a man with that kind of past? But Favreau pushed. He insisted. He said, "The best person to play a man who's lived recklessly and had to rebuild himself is Robert," and he was right. When Iron Man hit theaters in May 2008, it was more than a blockbuster. It was a resurrection. Downey didn't just play Tony Stark, he became him. The sarcasm, the genius, the pain, the charm, and it wasn't acting. It was him. His own story was reflected in every line. A man once broken, now armored. A man who had almost died, now saving others. It wasn't just acting, it was redemption. The world took notice. Critics praised his performance. Fans adored him. Kids looked up to him. The man who once woke up in strangers' houses now walked red carpets. The man who once cried behind bars now made millions laugh and cheer. But most of all, Robert Downey Jr. gave people something they didn't expect. Hope. Proof that no matter how far you fall, you can rise. That no matter how dark your past, your future can still shine. And this was just the beginning. In 2008, when the red and gold suit first hit the screen, it wasn't just a superhero origin story, it was Robert Downey Jr.'s second birth. Iron Man opened to overwhelming acclaim. The box office numbers soared, but more importantly, so did the spirit of a man who had once been discarded by the very industry now applauding him. For Downey, it wasn't about proving the world wrong anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could rise again, that he could do this clean, that he could earn his place, not through sympathy or nostalgia, but through performance, discipline, and heart. What many didn't see was what happened behind the scenes. The early days of filming Iron Man weren't easy. Studios were still unsure. Insurance was expensive. People were still holding their breath, waiting for Robert to relapse, for the other shoe to drop. But it never did. Because this time Robert had made a promise to Susan, to his son, and to himself. He kept that promise not with grand declarations but with quiet consistency. Showing up, being prepared, staying grounded. Day after day, he began meditating, journaling, and training. Martial arts became a part of his life not just for the screen, but for mental clarity. He embraced a new philosophy. Humility through discipline. The man who once spiraled through drug-fueled nights was now waking up early to rehearse, to train, to build a legacy worth living for. Iron Man's success marked the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But for Robert, it was something deeper. It was a resurrection of identity. He was no longer just a former addict or a cautionary tale. He was the face of a billion-dollar franchise. He was Tony Stark. And while the character may have been fictional, the journey of redemption was real. Over the next decade, Robert Downey Jr. carried the Marvel Universe on his shoulders. Each new film wasn't just a chapter in the Avengers saga, it was a chapter in his personal redemption. With every sequel, every crossover, every battle fought on screen, he was reclaiming more than just his reputation. He was reclaiming his soul. But fame has its own kind of pressure. The bigger the spotlight, the harder it can be to maintain inner peace. Robert didn't pretend it was easy. There were days of doubt, nights when the weight of expectation felt unbearable. But this time he had tools. He had therapy. He had Susan, who remained his anchor through the storm. Their marriage became a symbol of strength, proof that love, when rooted in honesty and healing, could withstand anything.
Behind the scenes, Robert became a mentor to younger actors. He knew what it was like to be young and famous, to feel untouchable and then to lose everything. So when newer actors joined the MCU, Chris Hemsworth, Tom Holland, Chadwick Boseman, Robert welcomed them not just as colleagues but as family. He advised them, protected them, showed them what humility looked like in the face of massive success. Perhaps one of the most touching dynamics was his relationship with Tom Holland. As the new Spider-Man, Tom was young, energetic, and stepping into a whirlwind of fame. Robert took him under his wing. He guided him, both professionally and personally, creating a real-life bond that mirrored the mentor-student relationship of Iron Man and Spider-Man. It wasn't for show. It was genuine, because Robert knew that without guidance, the industry could swallow you whole. Off-screen, Robert began using his platform to promote recovery and mental health. He didn't hide from his past, he owned it. In interviews, he spoke openly about addiction, about prison, about pain. And every time he did, he gave someone else the courage to believe in their own comeback. He didn't frame himself as a hero. He framed himself as someone who made it out alive and wanted others to know they could too. With success came influence, and Robert used his to support causes that mattered. He founded the Footprint Coalition, a venture dedicated to using technology for environmental good. It wasn't just about acting anymore. It was about giving back, about leaving a better world for his kids, about turning his legacy into something larger than himself. But no role defined his journey more than Tony Stark when Avengers Endgame was released in 2019. It wasn't just the end of a cinematic era. It was the emotional climax of Robert's decade-long transformation. As Tony Stark faced his final battle, fans around the world watched with bated breath. And when he delivered the line, "I am Iron Man," before making the ultimate sacrifice, it was more than just a catchphrase. It was a declaration, a full-circle moment. A man who once couldn't survive a day, sober, was now the emotional heartbeat of a generation. The scene where Tony Stark dies brought millions to tears, not just because a beloved character was gone, but because the man behind the armor had shown the world what true courage looked like, not in saving galaxies, but in saving himself. The reaction to his final scene was overwhelming. Fans created tributes. Artists drew murals. "I love you 3000 became a phrase that resonated in households everywhere. And for Robert, it was more than a job well done. It was healing. The tears were real. The grief was real. But so was the gratitude. In the years that followed, Robert stepped away from the MCU, choosing to explore new roles, new challenges. He starred in dramas, supported independent films, and spent more time with family. But wherever he went, the legacy followed. Not just of Tony Stark, but of the comeback itself. He didn't try to erase his past. He didn't run from it. He incorporated it into who he had become. Addiction never fully disappears. It stays in the background, waiting. But Robert understood this. He treated recovery not as a finish line, but as a lifestyle. A commitment renewed every day. He began speaking at recovery events, donated to addiction centers, used his story to open doors for others who were still struggling. He made it clear, you can fall, you can fail, but you can also get back up. Even today, Robert Downey Jr.'s story stands as one of the most profound transformations in modern entertainment. Because it wasn't just about career revival, it was about soul revival, about earning back trust, rebuilding relationships, learning to live without the crutch of addiction, and doing it all under the harshest lights possible. He once said, "Remember that just because you hit bottom doesn't mean you have to stay there." Those words weren't just a motivational quote. They were a map, a survival guide for anyone who ever felt broken beyond repair. From courtrooms to comic cons, from jail cells to red carpets, from overdose to overcomer, his story isn't perfect, it's real. And that's what makes it matter. Because in the end, Robert Downey Jr. didn't just play Iron Man, he became one. The spotlight, once a searing force that magnified every flaw and misstep in Robert Downey Jr.'s life, had become something else entirely. It was now a platform, a beacon of hope for those who thought they were too far gone, too broken to be whole again. The industry that once closed its doors on him had not just welcomed him back, but celebrated him. Yet, even in his triumph, Robert remained grounded. Wary of the illusions fame could bring, success didn't erase the scars. It didn't rewrite the pain of the years lost to addiction, of the friends and opportunities left behind, of the internal war that raged when the cameras were off. But he had changed. What once would have drowned him now became fuel, a source of strength, perspective, and depth. Every interview, every fan encounter, every quiet moment with his family was a reminder of how far he'd come and how close he'd been to losing everything. He often spoke about gratitude, not in some rehearsed, media-trained way, but with sincerity that came from lived experience. Gratitude for the second chance. Gratitude for the people who never gave up on him, even when he had. Gratitude for the chance to wake up sober, to be present, to choose each day with clarity and purpose. For Robert, gratitude wasn't a word, it was a practice. The public saw Iron Man, the billionaire genius wrapped in arc reactor-powered armor. But those who truly knew Robert saw a different kind of iron, a will forge through suffering, through humility, through relentless effort to be better than the man he used to be. He didn't just rebuild his life, he redesigned it from the ground up. Behind closed doors, Robert was a devoted husband and father. His relationship with Susan wasn't just the bedrock of his personal transformation. It was a partnership, built on honesty and resilience. She had met him when the world still doubted him. She had believed when belief seemed foolish. And in return, he gave her his commitment, not just to her, but to the life they were building together. They created boundaries that kept him healthy. No temptations, no late nights in toxic circles, no sacrificing well-being for the sake of fame. It was this discipline, this quiet, consistent effort, that formed the backbone of his real-life comeback. Discipline was his superpower now, not charisma, not charm. He became a student of self-mastery. He studied psychology, spirituality, even Eastern philosophy. He once joked that he was part martial artist, part Buddhist, part biohacker. Whatever kept him grounded, he embraced it. And perhaps that's what made his transformation so compelling. It wasn't about one grand moment or heroic gesture. It was the daily decision to show up for life, every single day. His bond with his children was sacred. Having once been the child in a household shattered by addiction, he understood the stakes. He wanted to break the cycle, to give his kids what he never had: stability, safety, presence. He would talk to them honestly, age appropriately, about his past, not as a cautionary tale but as a testimony of resilience. He wanted them to know that broken things can be mended, that darkness doesn't get the final word. Professionally, Robert began choosing roles with deeper meaning. While Iron Man had solidified his place as a box office titan, he sought characters that challenged him, that spoke to his journey. Films like The Judge, in which he played a troubled son returning to face an estranged father, mirrored themes from his own life. He no longer chased fame, it followed him. What he chased now was growth, authenticity, connection. When he returned to award shows, to late-night interviews, to comic conventions flooded with fans dressed in arc reactors and Stark Industries t-shirts, he no longer carried the weight of insecurity. He carried the quiet confidence of a man who had walked through fire and emerged, not unburned but alive. He knew who he was now. He had nothing to prove, only something to offer. And what he offered was more than just entertainment. It was healing. At charity events, he would often meet fans who shared how his story changed. Their lives, recovering addicts, ex-convicts, teenagers struggling with self-worth. They would tell him that if he could do it, maybe they could too. He listened. He cried with them. He gave more than a smile. He gave his presence. There was one particular moment that went viral. A fan, a young man shaking nervously, broke down in front of Robert, thanking him not just for Iron Man, but for surviving. The young man was in recovery himself, and told Robert that it was his openness, not his movies, that gave him the courage to get clean. Robert hugged him, held his shoulders, looked him in the eye and said, "You're the hero now." That's the kind of man he had become. The irony was never lost on him. He had played a man who built armor to survive, but in real life he had to take all his armor off. Vulnerability was what saved him. Letting go of ego, asking for help, saying I'm not okay when he wasn't. Those were the things that led him out of hell. Robert never glamorized addiction. He didn't tell stories for shock value or to earn sympathy. He told them because he knew someone listening might be where he once was, on a bathroom floor, shaking, lost, thinking the story was over. He wanted them to know the story wasn't over, and it wasn't just addiction. He talked about anxiety, depression, the pressure of public scrutiny. Fame, he said, magnifies everything. If you're broken, it makes you more broken. If you're healing, it forces you to heal faster. But either way, it's not a solution. The real work happens in the quiet, in the small choices. His legacy became more than Iron Man. It became a blueprint. He spoke at prisons, at youth centers, at sober living facilities. He gave generously but without fanfare. He didn't post it on social media. He didn't need the world to see. He just needed to show up, because he remembered the people who had once shown up for him when he had nothing to offer. Even within Hollywood, his redemption created ripples. Producers who once blacklisted him began giving second chances to others. Directors who once looked past struggling actors now thought twice. His story reminded the world that people aren't disposable, that talent is valuable, but humanity is sacred. And it wasn't just Hollywood that changed, it was Robert. He became someone others trusted, not just professionally, but emotionally. A friend, a husband, a father, a mentor. He stopped running from the boy who had been handed drugs by his own father. He stopped hiding from the man who had slept in a stranger's bed. Strung out and alone, he embraced every version of himself, not with shame, but with compassion, because that's what healing is. It's not pretending the past didn't happen. It's holding it in your hands gently and saying, "You don't define me anymore." As time passed, Robert Downey Jr. began to notice something profound. He was no longer acting to be seen, validated, or redeemed. He was acting because he loved the craft again. Acting had once been his escape from reality. Then it had become his punishment, a reminder of what he'd lost. But now it was his expression, his canvas, his way of exploring humanity with all its light and darkness. There was an authenticity in his performances that hadn't always been there in his early years. Not because he lacked talent, he had always been electric on screen, but because now he brought the depth that only pain and healing could deliver. He didn't have to pretend to understand broken characters. He had lived them. He didn't have to imagine what redemption looked like. He embodied it. Fans didn't just connect to Tony Stark because he was cool or powerful. They connected because he was flawed, wounded, constantly evolving. And that was Robert. Behind every sarcastic line, behind every smirk, was a man who had faced death, isolation, and loss and still found a way to keep going. That reality bled into the character, giving Iron Man a soul that no CGI could replicate. And it wasn't just the audience that noticed. His peers began to speak differently about him. No longer the brilliant but dangerous wild card. Robert had become a symbol of steadiness. Younger actors would often seek his guidance, not just about scenes or dialogue, but about navigating fame, pressure, and purpose. He never played the guru. He simply told the truth. He would say, "Fame won't fix you. Drugs won't fill the hole. And success without peace will destroy you faster than failure ever could." It was the kind of advice that didn't come from theory. It came from living with the consequences of getting everything you wanted and still feeling empty, and then learning how to rebuild from the ground up. He began turning down roles that didn't serve him. He no longer needed to chase relevance. He had created a space in the industry that only he could fill, space built not just on talent, but on testimony. When he chose a role, it was because it resonated, because it mattered, because it challenged him to explore a new facet of humanity. At home, life became sacred. The little things, making breakfast for his kids, driving them to school, spending quiet evenings with Susan, those became the real rewards. They were the moments that kept him sane, connected, and awake. There was no red carpet that could compare to the sound of his children's laughter, no trophy that meant more than his wife's steady hand in his. And yet, even in stability, he never let himself get comfortable. He knew what complacency could cost. He remained vigilant. Therapy, meditation, fitness, community. These weren't things he did when things got bad. These were the pillars that kept him strong, even when things were good. He didn't wait for a crisis to do the work. He stayed ready. Publicly, Robert became more than a movie star. He became a cultural figure. a reminder that no one is beyond saving. His interviews, once tabloid bait, were now moments of reflection, honesty, and often wisdom. He could sit across from a talk show host and make the world laugh, and in the next sentence offer a truth so raw, it would silence the room. He would say, "I used to think being the life of the party meant I was alive. Now I know that being present with the people I love, that's living." His story was shared in recovery circles, studied by counselors, admired by artists. It wasn't because it was dramatic, it was because it was real. Because it showed that transformation isn't a straight line. It's a jagged, painful, beautiful climb. And sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is simply not give up. He started producing more, giving opportunities to stories and artists that would have once been overlooked. He wasn't interested in blockbusters alone. He wanted substance. He wanted to be part of something bigger than the spotlight. He wanted to create space for other comeback stories to unfold. And the truth was, people listened, because when Robert Downey Jr. believed in something, you felt it. It wasn't a PR campaign. It was lived conviction. One of his proudest moments came not on stage or screen, but at a recovery fundraiser where he spoke alongside former inmates and recovering addicts. So he shared his story not with shame, but with solidarity. "We are not our worst moments," he said. "We are what we do after them." He didn't need applause anymore. He needed to be of service. There was a quietness about him now. Not silence, but stillness. A sense that he had made peace with the noise inside. That he had stopped running. That he could sit with who he was and not flinch. And yet his humility never dimmed his light. He was still hilarious, still quick-witted, still magnetic in a room. But now the charm wasn't a mask, it was an extension of joy. Genuine, hard-earned joy. He often reflected on the people he had lost along the way. Friends who hadn't made it. Talented souls swallowed by addiction, by the industry, by their own pain. He carried their memory with him, not as guilt, but as a vow to keep going in their honor, to keep telling the truth, to keep showing that healing is possible. When fans would stop him and say, "You saved my life," he would pause, look them in the eyes and say, "You saved your own life. I just reminded you that you could." And that was his power now, not the arc reactor. Not the fame, but the ability to reflect hope back at people. To mirror their strength when they couldn't see it for themselves. Years after Avengers Endgame, when rumors swirled about a possible return, he responded with grace. He didn't chase the past. He honored it. He knew that sometimes the bravest thing is to let go of what made you, in order to become who you're meant to be next. He once said, "The greatest role I'll ever play is myself, fully, honestly, and without regret." And in that role, he was flawless. He had been the punchline, the headline, the heartthrob, the has-been, the hero. But most importantly, he had become the human. Not perfect, not invincible, but real. And in this world, real is the rarest superpower of all. Robert Downey Jr. had become a living metaphor for redemption. He had fallen as low as one could fall in the public eye. Once a rising star whose name became a cautionary tale whispered behind closed Hollywood doors. But now the whispers had turned to awe, not because he'd returned as a movie star, but because he had returned as a man. A whole one. A man who stared death in the face and lived to tell others how to turn back before it was too late. His Iron Man legacy continued to impact generations. Young fans who were barely born when his life was spiraling now wore his image proudly. Not just for the cool tech or the cinematic moments, but for what Tony Stark and Robert himself represented, that it's never too late to turn your life around. His story had woven itself into the cultural fabric of hope. Parents used his example to talk to their kids about choices, consequences, and healing. Teachers spoke of him in classrooms as more than just a celebrity. He became a symbol, but fame wasn't the destination anymore. It was simply the vehicle for something far more powerful: influence. Not the social media kind, not the viral kind, but the lasting kind, the kind that seeps into hearts, encourages quiet transformation, and saves lives one conversation at a time. He began funding programs for recovery, not just high-profile donations, but low-key initiatives in places that never made headlines. Small towns, community centers, safe houses. He partnered with therapists, advocates, and former addicts, and he showed up. That's what shocked people most. He didn't just lend his name, he lent his time, his ear, his vulnerability. He would sit in circles with people in recovery and say, "I've been where you are. And I swear to you, there's a way out." Robert knew how important it was to be seen by someone who had survived the same storm. So he made sure to be visible, not as Iron Man, as Robert, as the guy who had wrecked his life and somehow rebuilt it stronger than before. But this life wasn't without temptation. There were still nights when the old voices whispered, when stress, or grief, or fatigue tugged at him. But now he had tools. He had built a life designed to keep him grounded. His marriage remained his anchor. Susan wasn't just his partner. She was his mirror, his moral compass, his soft place to land. She had believed in him when no one else would. And he loved her with a fierceness only possible when you know what it's like to lose everything. His children grew up, never knowing the version of their father that the world once condemned. To them he was kind, silly, wise, and present, and that presence became his greatest achievement. He had once been a man who couldn't be alone with his thoughts, who drowned silence in substances. Now he cherished quiet mornings, long walks, deep conversations. He knew that peace isn't a destination, it's a discipline, and he practiced it daily. As his career matured, so did his roles. He stepped away from franchises and leaned into meaningful work. Films with moral questions, emotional weight, and human messiness. Critics who once counted him out now hailed him as one of the most layered, soulful actors of his time. But Robert never let praise inflate him. He took it with the same humility he took the criticism in the past, with gratitude, but no dependence. His validation now came from within. He gave talks, not just at awards shows, but at universities, prisons, rehab centers. His message was always the same. You are not the worst thing you've done. You are who you choose to become next, and you can always choose again. There was a day, years into his recovery, when Robert visited the home he once trashed in a drug-fueled haze. It had long been sold, repainted, repurposed. But he stood across the street, silent, staring, not in shame, not in longing, but in awe. He whispered to himself, "That's how far we've come." The we wasn't just him. It was every part of him, past and present. The scared boy, the reckless youth, the desperate addict, the humbled survivor, the father, the husband, the hero. They all walked together now, no longer at war. He began writing more, journals, essays, eventually sharing excerpts and interviews. His reflections weren't polished or poetic. They were raw, honest, sometimes even messy. But that's what made them powerful. He didn't present himself as the finished product. He presented himself as a work in progress, a reminder that healing isn't linear, that relapse is real, that shame is heavy but survivable, that love, real love, is what saves us. Hollywood gave him accolades. The world gave him admiration. But it was the quiet thank yous in coffee shops, the letters from recovering fans, the tearful hugs from strangers that meant the most. That was the legacy he was building, not in gold statues or billion-dollar box offices, but in the hearts he helped stitch back together. One day, during a quiet panel discussion on sobriety, he was asked what he thought was the turning point in his life. He smiled gently, thoughtfully, and said, "It wasn't a moment. It was a million little moments. Choosing water over whiskey. Choosing to call my sponsor instead of disappearing. Choosing to walk back into the room when shame told me to run. Every day I choose, and that's how I stay free." And that was it, freedom, not the kind money can buy. Not the kind success guarantees, but the kind that comes from owning your story, every broken chapter, from choosing integrity, even when no one's watching, from staying when leaving would be easier, from forgiving yourself fully, fiercely, finally. Robert Downey Jr.'s comeback wasn't a comeback at all. It was a resurrection, a total rebirth, not just from addiction, but from the false self that fame had once inflated. The man who stood before the world now wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to be liked or forgiven. He was simply trying to be useful, to be kind, to be whole. And that is why his story resonates so deeply. Because it isn't just about acting or addiction or Avengers. It's about us, all of us. About falling and rising and falling again. About choosing light in the darkest room. About the idea that maybe, just maybe, we're not too far gone. If Robert Downey Jr. can come back from the edge, from jail cells and courtrooms and lost decades, and stand before the world not with shame, But with strength, then maybe we can too. Maybe we can forgive ourselves. Maybe we can believe in second chances. Maybe we can start again. His journey is still unfolding. Recovery isn't a destination, it's a path. A daily walk, and he walks it with humility, courage, and grace. He once said, "I don't care what people think about me. I care what I think about me. And for the first time in my life, I can look in the mirror and smile." And isn't that the real comeback? Not from Hollywood, but from hopelessness, from shame, from the belief that you're unworthy. Because Robert Downey Jr. didn't just save himself, he showed us how to save ourselves. And that, more than any suit of armor, more than any blockbuster role, is what makes him the real Iron Man.